Ladies and gentlemen, I am so pleased to be in the city of brotherly love, and now having heard the history of how Aristotle got to phila, I will regale other people with that. Someone here has entitled my talk, Paths to Accountability, and I think I should start out by telling you what my concept of accountability in the context of a layperson trying to serve his church is. And it's a report of successful stewardship. I mean, it's not transparency, and it's not something that we who have often, and I've been one of them, have criticized our church for lack of, and that's mostly transparency. But I'm talking about the accountability we have, I feel, as somebody putting himself forward to serve the church, having a stewardship to deliver a successful account. Now, having said that, I'll just try to relate to you how principally in my role as a very long-time member of the Finance Council of the Archdiocese of Boston, what I learned and what I may be able to tell some of you that may be of use, and then I'm mostly interested in taking questions, learning some more myself, and maybe dealing with specific matters that may have occurred to you either before you hear from me or during the time you hear from me. And I do think all of you have a copy of the charter of the Archdiocesan Finance Council. You may not have read it yet. I do commit it to your reading. It's only about 4 pages. But I'll talk about that a bit later. Cardinal Law appointed me as a member of his first Finance Council in 1984. I've served through his term of office, I believe it was 2002, then under an interim archbishop, an acting archbishop for a couple of years, and since, I think about 2004, under the now Cardinal Sean O'Malley. I'm not here to regale you with facts and figures about Archdiocese of Boston, but I am here to talk to you about how I tried to, my colleagues on the Finance Council tried to help the church in its business life. As has been mentioned, I've served on boards and committees of universities, hospitals, and the Catholic Church. And I guess that some of you, if not most of you, might agree with the following observation. The people who populate and lead these noble institutions are often not well equipped by ability or training to manage their organizations according to sound business principles. In fact, especially in our church, they may have little understanding of the concept and execution of good business practices. And to me, that's a good trade-off. Short of having universal men and women leading our church who have expertise in all fields, Da Vinci or somebody like that. If I'm looking for real competence, I hope that the priests and bishops of our church will be great pastors. That's the talent I'm looking for. Leaving that aside for a moment, I will observe that good business practice is still essential, even if we have great pastors who don't have much interest in or capability in good business practice, and that's where lay people come in. The Catholic Church has evolved, I believe you would agree, over many centuries into an organization where the sharing of information, which has great benefits to many organizations, does not come easily. In fact, a culture of holding information very closely has existed for a long time, and I'm afraid still exists. But knowing all that, Jeff Boise and others had the vision and courage to found this roundtable. And just as importantly, they have had the persistence needed to succeed. And if I had to name the single most important virtue for a lay Catholic who wants to enable his church to achieve and maintain financial health, that virtue would be persistence. Many days you accomplish nothing. Other days you lose ground. But don't quit. Little wins will occur and periodic winning streaks will come. Real progress will be your reward. I am the first to admit that the path to early success as opposed to delayed success depends to a large degree on the personality and willingness to listen to lay financial advice in your bishop is a major matter. All bishops in the United States, as far as I know, or all ordinaries, I should say, are required to maintain a finance council. And at one extreme, we have bishops who use the finance council happily and productively for themselves and their chief financial officers. The other extreme, we have bishops who tolerate their finance councils and who seek their advice seldom and their approval only when required by canon law. Cardinal O'Malley is a superb example of the first group. Now on to Finance Council Charter as a tool, and I believe it's really a great tool. I believe that Boston's charter, which is in your packet, is such a charter, a great tool. And for that happy circumstance, we are in debt to the Diocese of Milwaukee, whose charter we emulated, Joe Finn, who is sitting here today, and who many of you know, who urged us to create such a charter, and Cardinal O'Malley, who encouraged us to do so. I believe that even in difficult situations, the process of conceiving, drafting, and getting a charter adopted can be very useful. The process itself. I don't think any ordinary in the United States can deny that having a charter for his finance council is a good idea. It is very much regarded as good practice. So, for those of you who may be interested in serving your bishop from a business point of view, if you don't have a charter, agitate for one. If you've got a meaningless charter that can be written easily on one page, agitate for a comprehensive one. He may not like it, and he may not even like you, but I suggest to you it can be a tool for moving lay leadership as it needs to move into a place where bishops don't just tolerate finance councils, but use them and listen to them. That concludes my direct remarks.
In my experience, John, you have been persistent in trying to make sure in various kinds of institutional settings that fundamental values are paid attention to. And in my years as president of Notre Dame, when you were one of my bosses, you were particularly adept in arguing the case for the importance of financial aid as a university priority. And thank God we made great progress on that, and a lot of that is attributable to you. But I want to ask, since you've lived in multiple realms, whether you believe what some people have said, that church institutions that are education-related and health-related have come much closer to replicating practices that have prevailed in the business world, than has been true in dioceses and parishes. If that claim is accurate, and of course it doesn't apply to everyone, what do you think the church could learn, the dioceses could learn, from what has gone on in other Catholic-related institutional contexts?
I certainly agree with the observation you've made that, in general, the other two groupings I have of universities and hospitals are, in most cases, far ahead of the Catholic Church anyway. To answer the question in response to the way you've asked it, what can be learned, I have found, as one of Notre Dame's trustees, I have found in the very same hospital system that Jack Connors now chairs in Boston, and I was the first finance chair, that just sharing needed information with people that you're asking to serve, lay leaders, is the first step. I mean, it's very hard to give sage advice to bishops who don't give you very much information, or in some cases, frankly, withhold important information. And it's overcoming, I'm afraid in some cases, just an institutional mindset of carrying to what I found in the Navy to be interesting, and I learned from that nobody should be told anything of a potentially sensitive nature that that person didn't need to know. That was the phrase, and that's a sound principle. In fact, I practice it in civilian life, but it can be carried to an extreme, and what is need to know to some people and some bishops is so narrow that and the fear of, let's say, unintended deleterious results from sharing information is so great that they make it very, very hard for these finance councils or other bodies to help them. So I would say it's just gritting your teeth and sharing information with people that you're hoping to receive help from.
John, if I could, I'd like to ask you a question about just the whole governance model of the church, the decentralized notion of it, that parishes are sort of semi-autonomous in so many ways, especially on their finances. Is that a hindrance in this day and age, that model of the sort of localism that operates in the church, in your opinion?
To use your word, it is a hindrance in the respect that a central authority that could mobilize money from more affluent, call them successful parishes, and support or subsidize, if you want a pejorative word, parishes that couldn't. It is a hindrance in that respect. I don't want to spend a lot of time, on the one hand and on this hand and so on. There are disadvantages to having a center that can tax heavily to deploy resources elsewhere when, in fact, the people being taxed have little to say about where the money's going. Just going back to the founding of our republic, I think the American model and the Catholic Church model are very different, and here we are, Americans who are Catholics, and we live all the time with a reconciliation of two approaches to how to run things, and it makes it interesting. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, I'm thinking of things, so we were talking yesterday about centralized purchasing, for example, economies of scale, that sort of thing. It seems that the structure itself sort of gets in the way of that.
And matters of facilitation like that, I fully support, you know, those obvious things, centralized purchasing, a lot of such, creation of databases to find talent. All of these things should be shared, way overdue. I asked the question yesterday of people in the Archdiocese because I had read what you guys have been doing and try to encourage group purchasing or preferred provider populations. And I learned that very recently in Boston, we've moved towards trying to act as a beacon for the New England diocese first to do this sort of thing, and Boston is very open to, once it gets some expertise, to joining in larger groupings across the nation.
Okay, we'll take another question.
Yes,
Do you have a position on a requirement of an external audit for individual parishes?
I don't feel that it is essential. If the diocese itself has access and takes advantage of that access to its any given parishes or all of its parishes' financial operations. We are honing our skills in Boston at that matter, and gathering data, we're getting it. So I think my answer to your question is certainly you could leave it as something that might be in some circumstances desirable, but I don't think it's necessary. If you have the right information gathering at the diocesan level. Yes?
Could you speak a little bit about your perspective on the role of Finance Council and attention that we have sometimes on our council, which is what's the scope of responsibility? Because as I look at the documents that you have, you talk about the approving the budget for the entire expenditures of the diocese in terms of its governance for its whole mission. And sometimes we find ourselves falling into approving the budget of the Chancery, which isn't very exciting, which is not really materially impactful on the work of the church throughout the whole diocese. And one of the things that we're trying to formulate an approach for is what's the scope in terms of the fiscal responsibility of the Finance Council in approving funds and the relationship to the mission of the whole diocese, and not just get into, this Chancery personnel approval, and budget cycle.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, and unlike some politicians who say that when they mean exactly the opposite, this needs clarification. Boston has treated the Finance Council's role as being, in terms of governance, and Joe Finn is listening very carefully to me now, to deal with what we call central funds, which I think you're calling the Chancery, which is about a $15 million budget in our case. We don't view our parishes as part of the universe over which the Finance Council has budgetary authority. Now, we may be, Joe's going to correct me or help me in a moment, we may be out of line on that, but that's where we are. If you read our charter, I mean, we stick to this particular language in what is it, one or two canons that deal with expenditure of funds beyond a certain number of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. And we interpret that as central funds. We do not interpret that as all or any or all of the parishes acting individually, which they do. On the matter of advice and counsel, the Finance Council has grown and is still growing into a body that offers advice to the Archbishop on a lot of things, including parishes, numbers of parishes needed, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, sort of that big question, since you're from Boston, and obviously the settlements relative to sex abuse at the time were the largest in the country, followed by the sale of property that had been belonged to the Archdiocese for many, many years. And then from what I understand, although I don't have any facts on that, potentially some issues with regard to pensions of priests and so forth. Those are very heavy issues for Finance Council. And I'm just wondering if you have any innovative solutions that you came up with, any best ideas, anything you could share with any of the other dioceses that are represented here, or organizations that are facing similar, I won't put a word on it, but similar struggles, if you will.
Let me start out by informing you that during the firestorm of the sex abuse scandal breaking in, 2001, and Cardinal O'Malley's coming on the scene in 2004, 2005, the Finance Council really had very, very little role in dealing with the huge financial outfall. And that was because the Finance Council had been, let us say, consulted not very often, and was not as well informed as it should have been. So, again, information is the most valuable commodity, currency, or anything else you can name when it comes to a lay group of Catholics trying to help its church, and whether it's in the form of a Finance Council or some other body. So I'll come right back to that, getting that information from your bishop. I do remember one day we actually did something I remember fondly, and bittersweet memory. When the first settlement had in fact been agreed by the Archbishop with our very first, our most famous or infamous abuser, the Finance Council, and I think I had something to do with this, just said, this is too much money. It was a $13 million settlement of some of the allegations against one priest, some of the allegations. And we just said, at this rate, there's not enough money in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts if this priest is at all typical of what we may be seeing, and so on and so forth. So we actually, for the first time I remember, refused to authorize the expenditure of more than whatever the amount is. It's $500,000 or $1 million, I forget. So they had to go back and say the Finance Council, the Archdiocese of Boston, just refused to honor the settlement, and of course the lawyers went crazy. The Boston Globe wrote an editorial about how we were a bunch of Neanderthals and everything else. But the settlement was done for $10 million instead of $13 million. And that's anecdote that's apropos of nothing, but I can't resist repeating it. That sort of thing, the way we're operating today, would never even come close to happening if we had information. Hey, look, in terms of getting the money up, I can't tell you anything. Every situation is entirely different. If we didn't own a lot of acreage right across Commonwealth Avenue from Boston College, we were land rich, very few buildings, lots of trees, lawn. They were stacking building on top of building over there. They needed land badly. I mean, it was just an ideal situation. And BC wrote the checks. We endorsed them over to the lawyers. And that's how we survived.
John, I think we're going to have to bring our session to a close. Please save your question because we are running way behind. We need to move on. But on behalf of the Roundtable, I want to thank you so much for coming down here from Boston and being with us this morning.